If you think real writers just sit down and let the story bleed out of them without a plan, you've been sold a myth. And it's probably killing your novel. It's why you get halfway through a draft and suddenly lose steam, or why your story ends up meandering, unfocused, and nearly impossible to fix. Here's the truth: pantsing isn't what you think it is. And once you see what real writers actually do, you'll be able to fix your process and finally finish a marketable story you're proud of. Myth number one: pantsing equals drafting. You might think that when you're pantsing your book, just letting the story pour out scene after scene, you're drafting. But pantsing, discovery writing, is not drafting. Pantsing is brainstorming of the idea generation variety. Yes, it's valuable. It's fun. And for a lot of writers, it's how you finally start to see what's in your head actually take shape on the page. But it's important to distinguish this phase from the true drafting phase, especially if you're not just aiming to write for yourself, but you're aiming to ultimately have a marketable book. Here's why. Here's the science behind why making this distinction is crucial for writers who want to finish books that readers truly connect with. When you're discovering your story as you write it, your brain is in an immersive form of brainstorming, driven by the brain's idea generation systems. Studies using brain scans have shown that this type of writing mostly runs on the default mode network, or DMN, your imagination network. The DMN excels at spontaneous idea generation, associative thinking, improvisation, and unconstrained narrative exploration. In essence, the core activities of free flow thought. This network gives you your wildest plot twists, vivid imagery, and original story ideas. It's what lets you invent characters, build worlds, and follow unpredictable threads as you write scene after scene. It's exactly what you want for exploring voices or feeling out your story's tone or world. But the DMN doesn't naturally impose order, structure, or goal-oriented progression. Left alone, it risks wandering, getting lost, or producing a draft that lacks coherence and direction. It doesn't organize all its ideas or track pacing. It doesn't test whether the big twist actually pays off, or evaluate if your subplot is stealing the spotlight. It doesn't even work toward a goal, a point for your story on its own. That's the job of your executive control network, or ECN, your brain's planning and decision-making system. It organizes plot beats, sequences events, structures, and sets goals. The crucial pieces needed for drafting that's more than an exploration of ideas. In brain science, creativity is typically defined as the ability to generate novel and useful ideas, ones that are suitable to some situation or have some value or impact, because the creative process extends beyond idea generation to selection and evaluation. It's how it happens in our brains. And the takeaway is that the most successful creative work doesn't come from one network alone. It comes from the interplay between the two. The DMN generates possibilities. The ECN selects, organizes, and strengthens them, so the story works as a whole. Neuroscience studies on creative performance show that this back and forth, toggled by the brain's salience network, is where the real magic happens. If you rely on pantsing as your drafting process, you're going to get a lot of raw material without giving your ECN a chance to step in and shape it, which means your draft is essentially a very large brain dump document. Exciting and full of possibility, but also meandering, unfocused, out of steam, and often impossible to revise without tearing it apart. The problem here isn't that you brainstormed through discovery writing. It's that you treated the brainstorm as the draft. More on that in a bit. However, because I know you're thinking it, let's just get it out of the way. Aren't there real authors who wing it and can pants their way to a marketable novel? First, let's address the fact that distinguishing authors as real or not based on some success metric rather than the fact that they've authored words in some fashion is completely bogus. And even if we do go with the idea that some authors can wing it and do just fine, well, they don't. Not exactly. They either do plan their novels, or it only appears that they can wing it. The latter are rare. They're mystical. And their pantsing isn't even quite the kind we're talking about here. These unicorns have internalized story structure and technique so deeply they perhaps can write into the dark in a way that manifests on the page in a pretty publishable shape, but they're usually only skipping the steps on paper. They may not be as conscious of all the process stages anymore because they happen in the background and more internally, keeping it all in their heads and drawing on it as they draft. But that takes years, often decades of craft mastery. And even they tend to circle back to planning and structure or basic exercises when something isn't working or they just want to push the story further. But understand that being able to do the mental story math rather than showing your work and going through the writing stages that amplify your brain's abilities is not an indicator that you are a real author or a unicorn. A real unicorn knows it's better to do what needs to be done, no matter how that looks, to produce the best story possible. After all, it's the stuff they're made of. And for my ADHDers, this is especially necessary to understand. You need to get the most out of your brain, your most valuable asset as a writer, despite the relationship you may have to the way it works. ADHD brains tend to have increased activity and connectivity with the DMN. Idea generation and creative leaps come easily, but the ECN, which handles structure and follow through, is less active and harder to engage without external scaffolding, like the more structure and goal oriented phases of the writing process. Plus, the salience network, which helps switch attention between idea generation in the DMN and focused evaluation in the ECN, is less effective in ADHD. This can lead to all those things that aren't new to you, like trouble prioritizing which ideas are most relevant or useful, because it's always everything, everywhere, all at once. You might also have difficulty shifting from brainstorming to more focused drafting or editing, or from daydreaming to task-focused work. That's why so many ADHD writers get stuck with endless pages of draft that's really unstructured brainstorming. By reframing pantsing as what it really is, idea generation, you can intentionally pair it with the planning phase your brain needs to actually finish a cohesive, marketable book. So pantsing, for anyone, isn't the problem. It's stopping there or thinking that it's more than it really is that keeps you stuck or feeling like a failure, when it's not shaping up to be the story on the page that you imagine so vividly in all those daydreams in your head. The real work, the part that turns your ideas into a marketable story, happens when you take that brainstorm and shape it into a plan that works. Myth number 2, you're either a planner or a pantser. So, no. Real writers aren't pantsers or planners. Understanding that pantsing is idea generation brainstorming, not drafting, it's easier to see why the planner versus pantser debate is built on a false choice. You're not a pantser. You're not even a planner. Not just a planner, anyway. Use the term plantser if you must, but honestly, you're a writer. A creative human working with your brain's processes of daydreaming and evaluating as it must for your writing. By understanding this, you can make that creative process and your writing production more efficient by knowing how to use each stage, each network to its strength. Because your brain's creative process needs both. Brainstorming, not just the free-flowing idea generation kind, needs both. Both the DMN and ECN of your brain must work back and forth together for creativity. But efficiency and productivity increase dramatically when their strengths are applied in the correct stages, meaning you can optimize your creative writing process and set it up for completing a solid story that delivers emotional impact and payoff for readers by following the writing process stages in the order that lets the process fall more heavily on the DMN first and then the ECN in cycles throughout those stages. For many writers, it's absolutely necessary to pants, at least some of the time, to see what it is they even think as the words spill out on the page. And it's still a very valid, useful practice to engage the DMN most strongly. But discovery writing doesn't cancel out planning and outlining. It just means it might start the process or come in as a tool to get out of a rut or get unstuck. But to ultimately create a marketable book, authors are always going to have to go back to plan rather than thinking they can run forward with their pantsed draft. My experience shows this really never works the other way around. Authors I've worked with who did not start from a foundation in story structure and pantsed their draft before they brought it to me always needed to replan it. Not that the pantsed draft wasn't useful. It was a great exploratory brainstorm to work from and replan faster with. But without going back and outlining, they simply didn't have a way to move forward with revisions. They were too lost in what it needed. An outline or preliminary structure allows the ECN to set the problem space for the DMN to operate more productively during drafting. The two networks engage in efficient back and forth with the ECN constraining the DMN's generative capacity so that drafting is directed toward completion rather than endless generation. Yes, I'm looking at you because it's also me. And for ADHD and neurodivergent writers, this balance is even more critical because your brain may not work in balance without help. Outlining acts like an external scaffolding for your ECN, helping you focus, prioritize, and actually get to the end instead of endlessly wandering through your brainstorm. Without a plan or outline, you're in for cognitive overload and decision fatigue. Your working memory, while discovery writing, is constantly tasked with inventing new directions, organizing information, and maintaining coherence, overburdening both DMN and ECN, and often causing projects to stall, fizzle out, or become fragmented. Because the ECN doesn't have an established structure, assessment and revision become much more difficult and overwhelming, leading many pantsed drafts to require complete rewrites. And planners, you're not off the hook either. I've seen plenty of self-proclaimed outliners stall out in a different way by never letting themselves get into the weeds of actual prose. Sometimes the novelty and momentum are gone by the time they start drafting because they've already got the ideas out in a way. Or they cling so tightly to the outline that they never give the DMN space to surprise them, and the draft comes out as a half-hearted way to string the outlined beats together to get it done. The truth is, the best novels and the most resilient writers make use of both modes without letting one take over. Some initial discovery fuels the outline with richer ideas. The outline then shapes those ideas into a story worth finishing. The best way to know where your story is going or how it's working is to do an overview outline. That's exactly why I created my spellbook outline template, which is perfect for optimizing this process. It's a high-level outline for your story's turning points, just enough structure to keep you moving forward while leaving space for discovery along the way. Whether you're deep into a pantsed draft or staring at a million planning notes and outline variations that have gone cold, this approach keeps both networks engaged and your momentum alive. You can grab it at the link in the description and start plugging in the major beats as you develop them. Because here's the truth, great writers don't lock their identity into one or the other. They learn to use both pantsing and planning to switch between them when the story needs it. Myth number 3, outlining makes your draft bland and formulaic. But if you've ever said, I can't outline, it kills my creativity, I get it. Maybe you've tried outlining in the past and ended up with a story that felt lifeless by the time you drafted it. Or worse, you lost all motivation because you already figured the story out and the novelty seemed dead. The problem isn't actually the outline, it's how you're using it. A good outline doesn't dictate your creativity, it gives it something to push against, some direction and limits to get more creative within in a positive way. All so your story can do its thing, but better. And so you still have the freedom to explore while ensuring the story actually gets somewhere worth going. But a rigid process of only outlining first leaves little space for the DMN to do its work, to be creative and see what your story needs. I'm looking at you, planners. And it might be why your story starts feeling stale. But an outline that's too loose or barely there can cause the opposite problem, where you get lost in the weeds and drift away from the needs and goals of the story or its emotional ley line or thematic core. This is why, no matter which side you've identified more with, discovery writing still has an important place as a valid way to brainstorm. But that's the real role it plays. It's an important nuance to recognize so that you don't treat your discovery writing as a draft. Seeing it this way frees you up to use it intentionally without expecting it to carry the full weight of a draft. Because as an editor and book coach, I've seen what happens to self-proclaimed discovery writers who do see their discovery writing as the drafting stage. And pretty much without fail, they end up, 1, with a draft that fizzles out because they don't know where it's going. 2, with a draft that needs to be replanned and overhauled from the ground up, usually by going back to an outline anyway. Or 3, with an endless project because they get too caught up in trying to write decent prose and therefore take years or decades to finish, if at all, only to find out that the story has major content issues. And I'm sure you know how crushing that feels. By understanding that discovery writing is a brainstorming method to see what the story is, what ideas come out of it for the story, it doesn't hurt so much to then use those ideas in a robust outline to draft a solid story from, not just a brainstorm version. Or if starting with an outline any earlier than a full draft seems anathema to you, it might at least free you up to write your pantsed discovery draft in a messy fast drafting method, which still allows you the same benefits of seeing how the story might unfold through free idea generation, but without trying to make it sound pretty on the page already. Without needing to make it feel like more than the brainstorming it is if you're confusing it with the drafting stage, especially when that effort will just be wasted. Either way, it's all to keep your DMN dominant in its rightful stage so that you can get to the ECN phase of judging what of these ideas is working and how to order it all for a marketable book in an outline. When you use discovery writing to explore your ideas, then shape those ideas through planning and outlining, you get the best of both worlds. You can even keep the excitement of writing into the dark without letting it waste your time. So you can still put those ideas to use, order them effectively, and deliver a story that actually works on the page. Or as a shorter, far more efficient version of all of this, here's my go-to method for facilitating the switch between DMN and ECN. Write a test chapter. So when your outline gets difficult because it's too hypothetical yet, or it's too hard to know what your story needs to have figured out, until you're in the weeds at the drafting page level, you can take some dedicated DMN time in writing a test chapter to see how it works out in practice without having to commit the whole draft that way. Then you can move back to the outline or your planning, knowing what details, world building, character personalities, and so on are needed, or how they affect things in the broader story. This way, you won't have to start over and rewrite completely or waste time meticulously planning something that ultimately doesn't translate to the page. Here's how it works. Start with mapping out your story as far as you can. Write a high-level outline, just your major beats and turning points. That gives your ECN enough of a map to work with. At the point when you get stuck, because you don't feel you know enough about the point of view character or the flavor, like the tone, setting, or other details of the story in other aspects, stop trying to force an outline and start writing. This will help you switch into DMN mode and write a small portion of your story out as an exploratory exercise. But, and this is important, don't get too carried away and ultimately procrastinate the rest of your planning process. This isn't the whole book. It's maybe a chapter or a few scenes. It's only enough for you to immerse yourself at a deeper level, play in your world, and feel out the life of the characters in your story. If all goes well, you'll be ready to finish more of your outline or whatever format you plan your books in with more insight and inspiration to work from. Unfortunately, it's not magic, but it is brain science, and that's basically magic. Still, the creative process requires the ECN's analytical phase to determine if what you created works for what you need. So you may need to repeat the process and try again. However, brain science also tells us that it's helpful to try really hard to push forward in your planning document again first. That way, when you switch gears and write out a test portion of your story, your brain will already have been activated in the right ways to produce more creative output. So sometimes attempting to force the outline can actually be a good thing. Then circle back to your outline and refine it based on what you've learned. This back and forth keeps both networks doing what they do best, It's how you stay creatively engaged without wandering off track, and how you keep your story structure intact without strangling the life out of it. And I'm not alone in experiencing the merits of this trick. In an episode of the Writing Excuses podcast from a while back, powerhouse speculative fiction author N.K. Jemisin revealed a bit of her writing process. And yep, you guessed it. She uses a test chapter to help her at the planning stage. It helps her create those deliciously complex narratives that are so good. Fun fact, I also learned that Jemisin too was diagnosed with ADHD later in life. And suddenly it makes a lot of sense why our processes look quite similar. If only that also put me on her level. So I guess this means if you're a little bit, or a lot of it, either way, neurospicy too, this trick might just help you strike the right balance in your planning and outlining process. Precisely because it keeps you switching intentionally between the DMN and ECN instead of getting stuck in one mode until the project stalls. It blends the best of both worlds. You can explore enough to keep your excitement alive while still building a coherent plan that will carry you to the end. The bottom line, outlining doesn't have to kill your creativity. Done right, it's the secret to keeping your story fresh and finishable. So if you're ready to outline in a way that supports your process, preserves your excitement, and still gives you a story structure that works, the next step is to learn how to build it. I'm going to walk you through exactly how to create a beat sheet using my overview outline method, the foundation of my spellbook outline template. This is the same flexible structure I give my clients, built from the universal story beats you'll find in any solid story structure method, but distilled to their most powerful cores, so you can hit reader expectations without making any of it feel forced. It's how you can keep your creativity alive while making sure your story works all the way through. Click the video on your screen now and let's build an outline you'll actually want to use.